So, good morning, students. So, welcome you all to another session. So, let's begin today's session. So, in the previous class, we have discussed about the female reproductive system, the male as well as the female reproductive system, the anatomy part, right? So, today we'll take up with the last part of the organism called the cockroach, right? And then we'll move on to the next organism, right? So, what we have left out today is the process of copulation, fertilization, as well as the process of metamorphosis in case of cockroach, right? So, let's begin today's session by taking up with the topic called as copulation, fertilization, as well as the metamorphosis in case of cockroach. Process of copulation followed by fertilization as well as metamorphosis in case of cockroach. Now, we have seen that these organisms, they are said to be sexually dimorphic organisms, right? So cockroaches are said to be sexually dimorphic organisms, and that's how we saw the male cockroaches as well as the female cockroaches to be different. So both the sex organs are present in two different organisms, right? So during the process of mating, what exactly happens is, if you remember the structures of the male and female reproductive systems, what we have discussed in the previous class, I told you that the process of fertilization usually takes place inside the female organism. Where exactly in the female organism? In the 7th abdominal segment, where there is something called as the genital pouch, or what we call it as the brood pouch. So in this genital pouch or the brood pouch, there is this process of fertilization actually happening. So for that, what exactly should happen? So whatever sperms are present in the male's body has to be transferred into the female's body. So that process of transfer of the male gametes, that is the sperms, from the male body into the female body is what we call it as copulation. So what exactly is happening during the process of copulation? If you remember, yesterday when we were talking about the male reproductive system also, I made mention of a point with regards to the sperms. Once the sperms are being synthesized in the testis, from the testis, they would start moving into the seminal vesicles, where they would be temporarily stored in the seminal vesicles. So during the process of copulation, what exactly is happening is the sperms would be grouped together, right? So I told you this, right? So the sperms would be grouped together along with the secretions of the seminal vesicle. Once they would come out of the seminal vesicles, as they pass through the remaining glands of the mushroom gland, they would first pass through the utricular majors, which are nothing but the long peripheral tubules. And I told you that the long peripheral tubules will now start secreting a layer around it, what we call it as the inner layer, right, which is being secreted by the long tubules, long peripheral tubules, which are called utricular majors. As they pass through the next gland, which is the utricular brevios, this is nothing but the short tubules. The short tubules again will now start secreting another layer around it. Right, and this entire structure, I told you that we would start giving it a name. So we started calling it as the spermatophore. Right, we started calling it as the spermatophore. Now, this spermatophore is the one which passes through the ejaculatory duct, right, and through the male genital pore, and it would be transferred into the female's body. But again, before it is transferred into the female's body, what exactly should happen? Right. So we know that the entire body of these organisms are covered by the chitinous exoskeleton, which we call it as sclerites. Right. So there is the sternum and the sternum, which would completely close the body of the both males as well as the female organism. Now, if this spermatophore has to be released into the female organism, what should happen? Both the sclerites should be open. As a result of which, the brood pouch would be exposed, and this spermatophore would now be released into the brood pouch of the female organism. So how exactly is that happening? If you remember again, I told you yesterday when we were discussing about the male reproductive system, I told you that the male reproductive system or the male organisms also has certain copulatory organs, which we call it as the phallomeres as well as the titillatus. So these phallomeres and the titillatus, just during the process of copulation, what exactly happens is both the male and female organism will start aligning themselves through their posterior end. So if this is the posterior end, so like this, they will start aligning themselves. As a result of which, whatever phallomeres as well as titillatus which are present in the male organism will now start opening up the tergum and the sternum of the female organism, as a result of which the brood pouch of the female organism will be exposed. Right. Once the brood pouch of the female organism is exposed, then the spermatophore, this entire structure, would now be released into the brood pouch of the female organism. So let us see what happens next. So just a few things here. Say if this, I'm not drawing the entire structure here, just a few things. the female organism cell, right? So this would be the vagina, and this would be the vaginal opening, and here we know is the brood pouch that would be present, right? So the vagina, the female genital pore, which would open up into the brood pouch, and here we said there would be another small gland which would arise, right, which we started calling it as the collateral gland, and here would be the left collateral gland, the right collateral gland, all that, and here we would have another opening here, which is the opening of this sac-like structure, which is called the spermatophore. This is what we have, right? And here we would have the the two ovaries containing the ovarioles. So we are not doing the ovarioles, all that, and the ovary, all that. Okay. So this entire spermatophore will now be released into the brood pouch of the female organism. So how it would be released is, as I said, the entire spermatophore would be released here. Once they are released into the female genital pouch, it would go and attach to the opening of the spermatheca, right? So it would start attaching itself somewhat like this. So here we would have the spermatophore, the inner layer of the spermatophore, which would attach here, right? And this would be the outer layer, which is being secreted by the uterine majors. And towards the inner side here, all the sperms along with the secretions of the seminal vesicle would actually be present. So this is how they would come and attach. So once they attach to the opening of the spermatheca, then you remember one more gland, what we spoke when we were talking about the male reproductive system, which is called the phallic gland. I told you one large gland called the phallic gland is being present right behind the mushroom gland. So once the spermatophore comes to this sort of a position, then the phallic gland will now start giving out its secretion. Right? I told you what is the function of that secretion. Also, the secretions of the phallic gland would now start hardening this structure. So once it has been attached to the opening of the spermatheca, the phallic gland would start giving out secretion. So how exactly? Let me just show you another picture here. How exactly it opens. Say if this is the spermatheca, what we have, right? The spermatheca. Right? So at the opening of the spermatheca, we have this structure, which would be the inner layer, right? And then there would be this outer layer that would be present, right? And towards the inner side, there are these sperms which are actually present. Now, this entire structure, the spermatophore, that is being present. Now, once this is the case here, then the phallic gland will now start giving out its secretion, such that the entire structure will now start becoming hard. So this is the secretion of the phallic gland. As a result of which, the entire spermatophore will start becoming hard. So why actually it should become harder? So that when the sperms are being transferred from the from the spermatophore into the spermatheca, this entire structure should not fall off. As a result of which, it should be hardened due to it would actually be harder due to the secretion of the phallic gland. So once this is done, once the phallic gland all gives out its secretion, all the sperms would be transferred into the spermatheca. So once the sperms have been transferred into the spermatheca, this entire empty spermatophore would actually fall off. Right? The empty spermatophore would fall off. Now what exactly is happening here? All the sperms which were there in the spermatophore, they are now present in this spermatheca. Okay, so this is what exactly is happening. Now, after this process, what would happen next? So this is the process what we have, right? So what would happen next? Okay, let me just draw this again. Okay. So this would be the vagina again here, connected to the ovaries, and here would be the genital pouch that is being present, and here again the same collateral gland, right? And then we would have the spermatheca here, and this spermatheca actually has the sperms which has been transferred. So this would be the end of ovulation. Once the sperms have been transferred into the spermatheca, that is the time both the organisms would separate from each other, and that would mark the end of ovulation. After copulation, the next step would be fertilization. Once the sperms are released into the spermatheca, now the ovaries, or rather the ovarioles which are present in each of the ovary, will now start releasing the ovum. So alternatively from each ovary. So one ovum from the left ovary, one ovum from the right ovary. So alternatively they will start releasing the ovums or the eggs, and those eggs would actually be released here into the genital pouch or the brood. So the ovaries are being released. As and when the ovums are released into the genital pouch, the sperms from the spermatheca would now again be released here. So the sperms would be released. Once the sperms and eggs are present, then there will be the fertilization happening. So the process of fertilization occurs. As a result of which there is this formation of zygote happening. Right. So once the zygotes have been formed, all of the zygotes will start arranging themselves in a specific order. Right? How exactly do they arrange this? There will be almost 16 fertilized eggs which are arranged in 2 rows of 8 each. So here they will have one ovum here. So this will be one egg, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So this is how they will start arranging. So 16 eggs would be arranged in 2 rows of 8 each. So once all the fertilized eggs starts arranging themselves in this manner, what would happen now? The gland, which is called as the collateral gland, will now start giving out its secretion. As a result of which, it would start forming a case around it, a cover around it, right? A case or a cover is being formed. Now, this case or the cover, we would start calling it as the utica. So there is formation of utica upon the secretion of the collateral gland. So what exactly is happening? After the process of fertilization, 16 eggs will start arranging themselves in 2 rows of 8 eggs each. Once they arrange themselves in this manner, what would happen next? The collateral gland or the collateral gland will now start giving out its secretion such that it would start covering this entire 16 eggs together to form a structure called as utica. Once the utica is being formed, then if you remember, yesterday I told you that inside the brood pouch, there are paired structures which we call it as the external genitalia in case of the female cockroach, right? Which we started calling them as ovipositors, right? So this utica will now, with the help of ovipositors, its shape would be slightly changed. So how would the shape be changed? It would start becoming somewhat like this. Right? The shape would start becoming like this. So inside this, there would be these 8 eggs being present. Right. So this position, so from here to this position is actually being carried out by the ovipositors, which are actually present in the genital pouch. Right. So once this has happened, or once the position has been changed, then the further development usually takes place inside this case, which is called as the utica. Right. So after the process of development, this utica will now start breaking open here at this particular region. As a result of which, whatever comes out of it would be called as the nymphs. Right? So nymphs are nothing but younger cockroaches. We would start calling them as nymphs. They are almost very much similar to that of the adult cockroach, but a few variations are seen. Their body would be transparent, where we know that the body of the color of the body of the organism, the adult cockroach is actually like dark brownish in color. So here it would be transparent. They will not have wings to fly. So those are the larval stages we will start calling as the nymphs. Right? The young form of the cockroach are called as nymphs. Now these nymphs would now start undergoing the process of molting. So they would undergo 13 moltings. Moltings are also referred to as ecdysis, right, or moltings. So they would start undergo 13 molt. So during each molt, there are gradual changes that usually take place in the body of this organism. As a result of which, after 13 molts, it would lead to the development of an adult. It would lead to the development of an adult cockroach after these 13 molts. Right? So this is what we have. Now the type of development here in these organisms, we will start giving it a name. We will start calling it as sporometabolous metamorphosis. Right? We will start calling it as sporometabolous metamorphosis. The reason why we call it as sporometabolous metamorphosis is because there is gradual changes happening of these 13 moltings that is actually taking place in the body of this organism. So the nymphs would undergo the process of development by undergoing 13 moultings, and finally it would lead to the development of this adult cockroach. Right? So this is what we have with the process of copulation, fertilization, as well as development in case of this organism, which is called as the cockroach. Right? So with this, we have done with the second organism what we have in the list, which is called as the cockroach. Right? So two organisms we have completed. One is the earthworm, and the second one is the cockroach. Right? So let's now take up the third organism, the last organism what we have in this chapter, which is called structural organization in animals, which is nothing but the frog. Right? So let's begin with the morphology of frog. Right? Okay, so talking about the frog, the morphology of the frog. So first let's take up the morphology, then we move into the anatomy of it. So talking about frog, I hope all of us are very much familiar with frog. So we have all seen a frog. So talking about frog, we are all very much familiar that frog belongs to the class called as amphibia. Right? It belongs to the class called as amphibia. So what does this term amphibia actually refer to? What does the term amphibia actually refer to? We know that whenever we talk about amphibia, only thing that strikes our mind is these are the organisms which have the ability to live on both water as well as land. But actually speaking, the definition of amphibia is slightly different. How do we actually define amphibia is? Amphibians are actually defined as the group of organisms which are dependent on water for the process of development. Right, for the process of completing their life cycle, we can put it this way, right? So the group of organisms which are dependent on water for completing their life cycle is what we call it as amphibia. So what does that actually mean? So if there is no water available, the life cycle of this organism cannot be completed. Right? If that is the case, that sort of organisms, we have classified them as under amphibia. Now, because of this reason, they have attained the ability to live in water as well as land. And that's the reason why we say adult frogs, they are completely said to be terrestrial forms. Only for the process of reproduction, they move into water because they are completely dependent on water for undergoing the process of reproduction. So without water, there is no life cycle of this organism. So amphibians are the group of organisms which are dependent on water for the process of, or for completing their life cycle. Now, when do we observe these organisms? We usually find these organisms only during the rainy season. What happens to these organisms during the peak summer or peak winter? We do not find them during peak summer or peak winter. Why exactly do they find, or what exactly happens to these organisms during peak summer and peak winter? In summer, they would undergo a process called as summer sleep. Right? In summer, they would undergo a process called as summer sleep. The technical term what we use for that is estivation. They would undergo the process called as estivation in summer, what we usually call it as the summer sleep. In winter again, they would undergo something called as winter sleep, what we actually call it as the hibernation. Right? So in summer, they would undergo this process called as estivation, summer sleep, while in winter, they would undergo the process called as hibernation, which we also call it as winter sleep. Now, what is the reason for the summer sleep as well as winter sleep, for estivation as well as hibernation? The reason is all of these organisms, they are all said to be poikilotherms. They are said to be poikilotherms. So what exactly are these poikilotherms? We know that poikilotherms are nothing but cold-blooded organisms. So organisms which do not have the ability to maintain a constant internal body temperature, we would start calling them as poikilotherms. Now, since all the amphibians, they are said to be poikilotherms or the cold-blooded organisms, right? They are said to be cold-blooded organisms. They will not be able to maintain a constant internal body temperature. As a result of which, in summer, they would go in for the process of estivation. In winter, they would go in for the process of hibernation. Now, why exactly they are going into this estivation? We know that you would have studied in your first year, right, biomolecules, right, the effect of temperature on the enzymatic activities, right? We know that all the enzymes that are present in the human body or any animal's body, they are completely dependent on the temperature, because only at something called as the optimal temperature, the enzyme activity would be maximum. We have studied about that in your enzymes, right? effect of temperature on the enzyme activity. As the temperature starts increasing, the enzyme activity will start increasing, but only up to a certain point, what we call it as the optimal temperature. But beyond that optimal temperature, if the temperature still increases, the enzyme activity will start dropping. And over a period of time, the enzyme activity will start becoming zero. The same thing happens here. During summer, as the surrounding temperature starts increasing, since these are cold-blooded organisms, poikilotherms, their body temperature also correspondingly will start increase according to the surrounding environment. Right. Enzyme activity will be maximum at a particular optimal temperature, but if the temperature increases, enzyme activity will start decreasing. As a result of which, it would even lead to the death of that organisms as well. Same with the winter also. In winter also, the temperature goes down. The body temperature is going down because they are said to be cold-blooded organisms. As the body temperature goes down again, the enzyme activity will start decreasing. As a result of it may, over a period of time, it may even lead to the death of the animal also. So to protect themselves from these conditions, they would go into a state of inactiveness, what we call it as the summer sleep, and with this estivation as well as hibernation. So this is what we have with these organs. Brief introduction with regards to this organism. Now let's get into the morphology of this organism. Now this body of this organism, that is frog, has two parts. Right? It could be divided into two regions. The first one is the head, and the second one would be the trunk. Right? So the body of these organisms is divided into two regions, the head and the trunk. And remember, the neck is actually said to be absent in these organisms. So these organisms do not have neck. The reason why they do not have neck is because they have to cut through the water. Now, if any organism has to cut through the water, the body has to be designed in such a way that it would be able to freely float in the water. And for that, all of these organisms, they usually have this body, which we call it as the streamlined body. So the body of these organisms is said to be streamlined, very much similar to that of the fishes. Right? So very much similar to that of the fish. And that is the reason why the neck is actually said to be absent in these organisms, and the entire body is divided into these two regions, the head and the trunk. Now, what all does the head actually contain? Head consists of a pair of bulging eyes. So there is one pair of eyes. And these eyes are said to be bulged eyes. Larger bulged eyes are actually present in these organisms. So they have a pair of bulging eyes. The second thing that is present is right behind each of the eye, there is a pair of membranous structures which is present. And that membranous structure is called as the tympanum. Right? So they would have one pair of the membranous structures which are called as tympanum. So here in these organisms, tympanum represents the ear. So the external pinna is actually absent, and tympanum is the one which is representing the ear, which is present right behind the pair of bulged eyes in the form of a membranous structure. The third thing that is present in the head is they also have one pair of nostrils. Right? So the snout of these organisms, they have one pair of nostrils. So these are the three things that are actually present in the head of the frog. Right? So one pair of eyes, bulging eyes. They have one pair of tympanum, which will start representing the ear of this organism because the external ear is absent, and they have one pair of nostrils. Right. Next, moving on to the trunk region. Trunk actually has two pairs of legs. Right. So trunk has two pairs of legs. Two pairs of legs. The first one is called there is one pair of four limbs on the four legs, and there is one pair of hind limbs or the hind legs. Right? So there is one pair of four limbs and one pair of hind limbs. Now, important things what you need to remember here. Four limbs have only 4 digits. Right? I hope all of you are familiar with what we mean by digits. Digits are nothing but fingers. 4 limbs have only 4 digits, while the hind limbs, they have 5 digits. Right? So this is one important thing what you need to remember. The 4 limbs of frog, they have only 4 fingers, while the hind limb of frog has 5 digits. Now, one important thing what we need to remember whenever we talk about 4 limbs in case of frogs, these organisms, frogs, they are said to be sexually dimorphic organisms. Right? So we know what exactly is sexual dimorphism mean. Male organism is separate and the female organism is separate. So sexually dimorphic Just by observing the morphological characters of these organisms, we are able to identify whether a particular organism is a male or a female. The same thing is applicable here. How do we actually identify whether the frog is a male or female? Two important things what you need to remember. The first one is with regards to the forelimbs. At the base of the forelimb, right? At the base of the first digit, at the base of the first digit in the four limbs of these organisms, there is something called as the copulatory pad or nuptial pad is being present. Copulatory pad or the nuptial pad is actually present at the base of the first digit in the four limbs of frog. So if we are able to find this swollen structure, what we actually call it as a copulatory pad at the base of the first digit in the four limbs of the frog, then we can automatically say that it is a male organism, because only males have these copulatory structures being present. Right. While in case of females, the copulatory pad or the nuptial pad is actually absent. This is one way how we actually identify between a male organism as well as a female organism. Presence of the copulatory pad at the base of the first digit in the four limbs of cockroach says that it is a male organism. Second way, how do we identify between a male and female organism? In between the head and the trunk, right, we said that there is no neck that is being present. At the junction of the head and the trunk, the male organisms possess something called as the vocal cords. Right? So vocal cords, if they are present at the junction of the head and the trunk, right? So that organism, we can say that it is a male organism, because female frogs do not have vocal cords. Right? So if vocal cords are present, it is male organism. And what is the location of vocal cords? The junction of the head and the trunk. Second thing, if copulatory pad or nuptial pad is present, it is again a male organism. And what is the location of this copulatory pad or the nuptial pad? At the base of the first digit of the four limbs in case of the male frog. Right? So this is how we identify between a male organism and a female organism. Right. Next one, talking about the limbs of this, hind limbs of this organism. So hind limbs, we said that it is said to be made up of 5 digits and it is said to be a highly muscular structure. It is said to be a highly muscular structure because of its highly muscular nature. In some of the countries, the hind limbs or hind legs of frogs is actually used as a food. So they consume the hind limb because of its highly muscular nature. So the hind limbs of frogs, it is said to be a highly muscular structure, and the entire weight of the body is actually borne by the hind limbs, and the hind limbs are the ones which are majorly involved in the process of locomotion. That if we know how the frogs actually move from one place to the other place on the land, right? So if they have to move from one place to the other place, usually they jump or they hop from one place to the other place. So for the movement of the frog in the land, it is completely the hind limbs which are completely involved in the process of locomotion, right? And that's the reason why it is said to be a highly muscular region. Now, we know that these organisms are amphibians. They live on land as well as water. Now, if they are living on land, the movement is completely taken control by the hind limbs. If they enter into if they enter into water, they have to swim through the water. Now, if they have to swim through the water, they have some sort of modification in their limbs. And those modifications is the limbs are modified in the form of webbed feet. Right? So the legs are actually said to be webbed. Right? So they actually have webbed feet, and this webbed feet actually favors the process of locomotion in case of water, right? So once the animal gets into water, because of the presence of webbed feet, I hope all of you are familiar with what we actually mean by webbed feet. Say if this is the digits, what we have, the fingers, right? In between the fingers we have gap, but in these organisms there is a membranous structure that is actually present in between the digits also, in between the fingers also, such that it gives a webbed appearance, so that these organisms, they are able to easily pass through the water, they are able to easily swim through the water, right? So this is what we have with the head and the trunk part. So head has these 3 structures, a pair of eyes, a pair of tympanum, and a pair of nostrils. Trunk majorly has 2 pairs of legs, a pair of forelimbs and a pair of hind limbs. Forelimbs have 4 digits, and there is presence of the copulatory pad present at the base of the first digit. Hind limbs, they have 5 digits and they are said to be a highly muscular structure, and they are completely involved in the process of locomotion when these organisms is on land. But when they move into water, both the hind forelimbs and the hind limbs have this webbed structures present in between the digits, which would lead to the development, which would lead to the formation of a webbed foot through which they are able to swim through the water. Right. So these are things what we have with regards to the legs of the organism. Right. Now, towards the posterior end of these organisms, that is the adult frog, they do not have tail. While the larval stage, which is the tadpole larva, they possess the tail. So we'll take up with the difference between the larva and the adult also once we take up with the last part, the fertilization as well as the process of development. For now, remember that adult frogs do not have tail. They have one opening towards the posterior end, and that opening is called as cloaca. Right? So this opening called as cloaca, or we can also call it as cloacal aperture or cloacal opening, is present towards the posterior end of the trunk. And this cloaca is one of the characteristic features of this organism, which is said to be a common opening for 3 systems. Right? Cloaca is said to be a common opening for 3 systems. And what are those 3 systems? Number 1, it is a common opening for the digestive system. Number 2, it is the common opening for the excretory system. And number 3, it is the common opening for the reproductive system. So the digestive system, excretory system, as well as the reproductive system. All of these 3 systems would open to the outside through the cloaca. So whatever undigested food is being formed through the process of digestion, that undigested food is sent out of the body through the cloaca. The second one, after the process of filtration of the nitrogenous waste, whatever nitrogenous waste that is being formed in the body of this organism will now be excreted to the outside again through the cloaca. The third one, as these organisms are said to be sexually dimorphic organisms, right? Males and females are separate. They are said to be unisexual organisms. The passage of gametes also occurs through this common opening, which is called as cloaca. So that's the reason why we say cloaca is considered to be the common opening for 3 systems. Number 1, the digestive system, the excretory system, as well as the reproductive system. One of the characteristic features that is present in the posterior end of the trunk of the adult cockroach. Right. So this is what we have with cloaca. One more important thing here is with regards to the skin of this organism. Now, talking about the skin here, the skin of this organism, 2 things you need to remember whenever we talk about the skin in case of frog. Number 1, the skin of frog is always said to be moist. Right? The skin of frog is always said to be moist. How exactly it is actually maintained moist? It is because of the mucus glands that are present throughout the skin. So the mucus glands which are present in the skin would constantly start secreting the mucus, as a result of which the entire body of this organism remains moist. And again, this moistness is also very, very essential for the exchange of respiratory gases, because we know that these organisms usually respire through their skin. We start calling it as cutaneous respiration. So for cutaneous respiration to occur, the respiratory surface, which is the skin, has to be kept moist. One of the properties of an ideal respiratory surface is it has to be kept moist. And the entire skin of these organisms is always kept moist, and that moistness is because of the presence of mucus gland, which would constantly start secreting the mucus. The second thing is the skin of this organism has the ability to change the color, right? And this process of ability to change the color of the skin, we would start calling it as mimicry. So why do they undergo the process of mimicry? Is to camouflage with the surrounding. Right? To camouflage or to blend or to mix with the surroundings, they would start changing their skin color. Again, one of the defense mechanisms of this organism. Right? So this is what we have in brief with the morphology of this organism, which is called as the frog. Right? So once we have done with the morphology of frog, let us now take up with the anatomy of frog. So let's begin with the first anatomy what we have. And the first anatomy what we'll be taking up is with regards to the digestive system. So we'll just begin with the digestive system today, and we'll see how far can be completed. Right. Now, talking about the digestive system in case of these organisms. So frogs have a well-developed alimentary canal, and they have a complete digestive system also. So we know what we mean by a complete digestive system. It is a well-developed, tubular, alimentary canal. Okay, so talking about the anatomy of the digestive system. Right. Okay. So these organisms, as I mentioned, they have a complete alimentary canal, and it is said to be a well-developed muscular alimentary canal. Now, these organisms, they are all said to be carnivores. So I hope all of you are familiar with what we actually mean by carnivorous organisms, right? So carnivores are the ones which would feed on other organisms. So these frogs usually feed on insects. So that's the reason why they're said to be carnivores. Now, one more important thing here. Now, since these organisms are carnivores, these organisms, they have a shorter alimentary canal, right? So this you need to remember. All carnivores, they have a shorter alimentary canal. So when we say shorter alimentary canal, we are actually focusing on the small intestine. They have a shorter small intestine. While the larger alimentary canal is usually seen in herbivores, right? So all herbivores, they have a larger alimentary canal, where the small intestine would be larger in case of herbivores. Whereas in case of carnivores, they would have a smaller alimentary canal. Right. So here, since frog is a carnivore, the alimentary canal that is present in frog is said to be a shorter alimentary canal. They have a smaller canal. So the order goes like this. Longer alimentary canal is seen in herbivores, then comes the omnivores, and the shortest one would be the carnivores. Right. So longest alimentary canal, herbivores, followed by omnivores, and then would come in the carnivores. Okay. Now let us take up with the alimentary canal as well as the digestive system here. The digestive system of these organisms, frogs, has two parts, two structures. One is the alimentary canal and the other one is the digestive glands. So there are two parts, alimentary canal as well as the digestive glands. So first let us take up with the alimentary canal. Let's talk a few things about alimentary canal and then we'll get into the digestive glands part. So first let us focus on the buccal cavity. So what about the buccal cavity of this organism? So if we have to do the buccal cavity, right? So this would be the buccal cavity. So this would be the upper jaw, and this would be the lower jaw, right? So this is the upper jaw, what we call it as the maxilla. Upper jaw, which is maxilla, and this would be the lower jaw, which we call it as the mandible. And this entire space will be the buccal cavity or the buccal chamber that is being present. Now, these organisms, they have teeth. Right, they have teeth. So the teeth is located in the upper jaw. So this is how the teeth are actually said to be arranged in this organism. Right, so this would be the teeth that is present in these organisms. Now, with regards to the teeth, a few important things you need to remember. Right, the teeth is present only on the upper jaw. Right, the lower jaw of frogs do not have teeth. Right? Now, since the teeth in case of frog is located only on the upper jaw, we would start calling such type of teeth as maxillary teeth. So the teeth here is called as the maxillary teeth. Right? It is called the maxillary teeth. Why it is called maxillary teeth? Because the teeth is present only on the maxilla, which is nothing but the upper jaw, the first one. The second thing with regards to the teeth is the teeth here, or the type of dentition. I hope all of you are familiar with what we mean by dentition, right? So the type of dentition here in these organisms, we would start calling it as the homodont dentition. The type of dentition here is said to be homodont dentition. Now, what do we mean by homodont dentition? Homo refers to the same, right? Homo refers to the same. How many ever teeth be present in the body of this organism? All the teeth are of the same type, all the teeth are of the same shape, right? We would start calling it as homodont teeth. All the teeth are of same type and same shape. So therefore, the type of dentition here in these organisms, we would start calling it as homodont dentition. The second type of dentition, what we call here for these organisms is, we would start giving it a term called as acrodont dentition. So it is called acrodont dentition. Now, what does acrodont dentition mean? Acrodont dentition refers to the arrangement of teeth superficially on the jaw bone. We know that human teeth is said to be arranged in the sockets of the jawbone. So if teeth are arranged in the sockets of the jawbone, such type of teeth we would start calling it as ecodont dentition. But here, since the teeth are superficially arranged on the sockets of the jaw bone, we would start calling such type of teeth as acrodont teeth, or such type of dentition as acrodont dentition. So what does that actually mean? If this is the jaw bone, right, the teeth are said to be superficially attached like this, right? So there are no sockets. If it is homodont dentition, if this is the socket, inside the socket the teeth are arranged like this. But since it is acrodont, so this is the surface of the jawbone. On the surface of the jawbone, the teeth are actually placed like this. What we call it as the acrodont dentition, where the teeth are said to be superficially attached to the surface of the jawbone, which is the maxilla. And the last type of dentition here, we will start calling it as the polyphyodont dentition. So this third type of dentition here, we will start calling as the polyphyodont dentition. Now, what does this mean, polyphyodont? Poly refers to many, right? So many teeth. So in case of humans, we know that there are only two sets of teeth. One is the milk teeth and the other one is permanent teeth. So in case of humans, we would start calling it as diphyodont dentition or diffeodont dentition. Whereas here, we are calling it as polyphyodont dentition. So what does that mean? During their lifetime, several times the teeth fall off, and as and when the teeth fall off, new teeth arises in its place. So several times this happens. In case of humans, only once the teeth falls off, the new teeth replaces the one which falls off. That's it. Only 2 times it is same. But here in this case, several times the teeth falls off, right? As and when the teeth falls off, new teeth arises in its place. So if that is the case, we will start calling it as polyphyodont dentition. Again, the reason for polyphyodont dentition is because it is said to be acrodont dentition. Since the teeth are said to be superficially attached on the jawbone, there are heavy chances that the teeth would fall off. Even if there is a small stone hitting on the teeth, also the teeth would fall off because there is no proper support to the teeth. As a result of which, whenever the teeth falls off, new teeth arises in its place. So we will start calling it as polyphyodont dentition. Right? So whenever we talk about teeth in case of frogs, these 4 things you need to remember. Number 1, maxillary teeth. Why do we call it as maxillary teeth? Because the teeth are limited only to the maxilla, that is the upper jaw. Lower jaw do not have teeth. Since the teeth is not present in lower jaw, teeth is not involved in the process of chewing the food. Second, homodont dentition. All the teeth are of the same type, they are of the same shape. Homodont dentition. Acrodont teeth. Acrodont teeth are said to be superficially attached to the jaw bone. And which jaw bone it is? The maxilla. Therefore, we will start calling it as acrodont dentition. And the last one is polyphyodont teeth. So that means whenever the teeth falls off, new teeth would arise in its place. The polyphyodont dentition. Right? So this is what we have in the teeth. And teeth is the one which is present in the buccal cavity. So we have some more structures present in the buccal cavity. So all those structures we'll take up in the next session, and then we'll complete with the anatomy of the digestive system as well. Fine. Thank you.